The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gooden, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Thank you, Mr. Otting, for taking the time to attend today's hearing, even if you haven't always felt welcome at times. Before presenting these questions, I just wanted to highlight the significance of today's hearing and a few pressing concerns around the intent and purpose of the narrative built around today's hearing. The CRA regulations that were in place since 1995 lacked objectivity, fairness, transparency, and consistency, and they were very confusing. And this isn't my personal take, but the concerns voiced by legitimate stakeholders in the 1,500 plus comments on the proposed note over the past 18 months. And I see your heads nodding in agreement. 98% of the comments said that current regulations are confusing. 94% of the comments said current regulations lack objectivity, fairness, and transparency. And 88% of the comments said that current regulations lack consistency. And in fact, the current regulations are riddled with loopholes, as we've discussed here, some that even allow for CRA credit for loans to wealthy households in the LMI areas, which inevitably lead to their gentrification, which is something that my colleagues across the aisle have voiced some disturbance with, and I agree with them. So it's only natural to conclude that we actually really do need broad reform of these policies, and we need it to be consistent, transparent, objective, and as clear as possible. And I believe that that will fulfill the CRA's true intent and purpose to ultimately serve LMI households and individuals. However, instead of supporting your reforms, which I think are great, the majority has decided to question everything throughout the stage, including their implementation. And I've heard a lot of reliance today on dissident voices. Earlier today, you were questioned about your knowledge of the overwhelming opposition that we had here a few weeks ago. It was difficult for you to get the response out, but only one Republican was at that. It was very partisan. So we've heard about this letter that I think was sent to you by members of Congress. They were all Democrats, so we've seen a very partisan take on this. But nonetheless, you're here. We're happy you're here, and thank you. I have a few questions. You mentioned that expansion of qualifying activities will encourage more capital investment, lending and services in LMI rural and distressed communities, and would you please expand on that?
Yeah. So 2 ways we think that that works, or actually 3 ways. One you identified by not allowing people to get credit for mortgages to high-earning people in low to moderate income areas. Second of all is publishing the list of what qualifies. So communities can look broadly in their community and say, where could we get credit for CRA, which would motivate a bank to take on transactions like that? And then the third is at the top of the house, once we look at the individual assessment areas, a bank can choose to move dollars at the top of the house around once they've met a certain criteria and go out to places like Indian country or family farms or do additional small business lending outside their assessment areas. We think that will populate more activity across America.
Thank you. In December, you mentioned there was a lot of support for the reforms from the public as well as banks, but you also stated there was strong opposition from certain groups. Who are those groups, and why are they against these?
There's a long list, but I would say, you know, Congressman Potter tried to put it into 2 buckets. Either they're on the take or they don't understand it. We've spent a lot of time trying to make sure people understood it. As the comments that you made, objectivity, transparency, all those things are what you would think people would want. But there are groups who are economically benefited by not having that objectivity. And when there is a merger or an acquisition, they show up and basically demand money from financial institutions or not support the merger.
Which leads to those loopholes I mentioned. And I'd like to know how you've tackled the issue in your reform proposal to kind of take care of getting rid of these loopholes that people are taking advantage of.
Well, I think you do it by having objectivity. Because if at any point in time, and if we're proficient at our goal, a bank will be able to know every 90 days whether they're in compliance with CRA. It's like capital. If we said to a bank, we're not going to tell you until after the exam whether you pass the capital exam, people would say, well, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard in my life. But that's kind of what we do with CRA. So if you can look at every quarter your balance sheet and decide, am I in compliance with the capital laws? Why can't we decide every 90 days if you're in compliance with CRA?
Thank you. I appreciate your time, and I yield back to the chairwoman.